The title for this plenary session is Towards a Strong Evidence, and our first speaker is Professor Claude Marcus from Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So what do we know? What evidence do we need? What do we have, and how can we go forward? I would like to start with a question: why do we become obese? And there are many, many risk factors, and I think you know all of them already, and you can perform so much research on this. You can modulate and you can look at fine-tuned things, but you can look at this in a totally different way, because all these factors listed here are risk factors. You don't become obese from any of them. There is not a single calorie that you will take in because of epigenetics, for example. So you can say the opposite, that it's quite simple. It's not rocket science. We eat too much and we have too low physical activity. That's why we become obese. So I think that is the perspective that we should have if we want to stop this. So we'll discuss prevention. We have two ways to go: increase physical activity and decrease energy intake. And if we start with the physical activity, we can say that it is extremely important. We need to promote physical activity. We know that it is very important for our health. We know that already from 2 to 4 years of age, you can see that if you have a high physical activity, it's good for your health. We know that it's possible to modulate it, or it should be, because we can see that in different social settings, if you compare 2-year-olds in China and in Sweden, they have different patterns of physical activity, indicating that it is possible to modulate this. With that said, we can discuss, is this important for obesity prevention? And when we discuss this, we have to remember that we have to look at physical activity with the objective measurements. You can't ask people about physical activity. It's totally unreliable. And if you do that, I must say that physical activity is not a major importance for obesity prevention or treatment. It's not. And this is based on many different research facts. First of all, if you look at the association between physical activity and BMI for children between 6 and 10 years, there is almost no association at all. Secondly, we know that obesity is highly associated with socioeconomic score, patient education, parent education, etc. But physical activity is not when you measure it objectively. We also know exactly the same thing when we look at very young children. When we look at children 2 years of age, it's not associated with parental obesity, the children's own obesity or weight status, with SCS, etc. That means that there are no evidence really that indicate that physical activity is of major importance for obesity development. And again, there are many studies who have tried to use physical activity to treat obesity and prevent obesity, but in the long run, these studies are telling us that it's not a good way. Do we accept this fact? No, we don't. And politicians, they don't either. You heard Gabriel Wikström yesterday. He said that he wanted to use physical activity to prevent obesity, despite that he has heard this many times. So we don't really accept the evidence. So if we go to the other part, to decrease energy intake, we can discuss how that should be done. And if we go to the scientist's best friend, the mice, we know that if you give them food, traditional chow, it's boring, but it's nice nutrients for the mice. we can see that they gain weight in a good way, and they will get lean and healthy mice. But if you give them not free access of this healthy food, but of more attractive food with high fat and sugar, they will become severely obese. Do we have any take-home message for us here? I think there is, because I think the conclusion is that if we want to prevent obesity, we have to eat more boring. And this is something that can be questioned if we really accept, because we always want to say that we can eat more healthy food, and then we can eat good and nice and attractive food. But you can become obese even if it is a healthy food, if you eat much of it. And if you like it, there is a trend that you eat more. So I think this is a take-home message that is hard to accept. We in this room know that sugar increases obesity in children. It doesn't do that directly in mice, but it does in children. There is a nice study published some years ago when they had a double-blind study for young children, and they got a can with soda, either with sugar or with sweeteners, double-blind for 18 months. And these extra calories that they got in this way, it caused an increased weight gain and increased fat percentage for these children. So I think there are clear evidence that we need to reduce the amount of sugar in their daily life for children. We know it, but I don't think the politicians really have taken this to their heart. Is it possible to use this in prevention? Well, yes, I think it is. Some years ago, we performed the STOP study, Stockholm Obesity Prevention Project. We randomized schools to intervention or control, and we tried to do many things. We tried to affect the diet, we tried to affect the physical activity, and the schools, they claimed that the children were much more physically active, but when we measured it objectively, there were no difference compared to control schools. We did not focus on education. We focused on learning by doing. We said that this is the way you live at school and after-school care. The most important thing it turned out to be, because there we could really see a significant difference compared to the control schools, was that we banned all sweets, both at school, after-school care, and at birthdays, etc. No sweets at any form, no cakes, nothing in this area. Could this affect the children's weight? Well, it turned out that it could. We could see that during 4 years, we could see a reduction in overweight and obesity in the intervention schools compared to the control schools. Was this only due to what happened in school? Probably not, because what we also could see, that despite that we did not use education, in the intervention schools, the amount of unhealthy food intaken by the children during daily life was lower at home. We don't know, but we think that this is due to that if you have very strict rules at school and after-school care, it's much easier for the parents to say no. It's tough for parents to say no to sweets if the children are getting that by the professionals at school and after-school care. So I think this is a clear message that you could do things if you are a politician. Do we react on this, or do the politicians do? Well, no. Another example of the problems that we have handling the evidence is regarding early primary prevention. There are numerous of studies on this. These are the 4 very good, very ambitious, very big studies in different areas of the world and with different approaches, but all on parental education. They have something together. There was no effect in the long run of any of these studies. So I think the evidence-based conclusion of that is that primary prevention based on information to parents does not work. Do we accept this? No, we don't, because this is not what we want to see, but this is what it is. And I think that is one of the problems. So when we discuss the evidence and what we really need, I think that what we need is to accept the evidence we have. We have to accept the world as it is and act based on that. And we have to try something new instead of repeat the same things, despite that we should realize that it doesn't work. And we need to convince the politicians to do the same, and that is a tough one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claude. I think you have lots of questions for him, so there are some microphones going around, I think, so just raise your hand if you want to talk. Yes? Microphone people, where are you? Yes, here it comes.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that was absolutely brilliant and exactly what I know to be true. How, though, do we get people to switch away from trying to promote more physical activity for obesity prevention and to try new things? How do we do that?
I think it's extremely difficult. I've discussed this with politicians, and it is very, very, very difficult because they are like we are. They like evidence when it goes in the same lines as your own prejudice. And, but they are more like they are than they should be, really. So I think it is a tough one. But we need to work on this, and we need to repeat this. But we have to start with ourselves, because it is tough. Because everybody, when we discuss this, say always the same. We have to increase physical activity, despite that we know that it doesn't work. So I think we have to start with our own community here and try to realize that this is true.
But do you think have you said to them, stop talking about exercise, start talking about eating?
I say to them that if you want to prevent obesity, you can't do it by increase sports, for example. You can't. And they say, well, I still think this is a good way.
But is it because it's so easy for them to point to the schools? Politicians very often just point to the schools.
Yeah, they do. But I think it's more that physical activity, it's positive. It's nice. Everybody likes it. The children likes it. You feel that you're doing something good for the population who you want to vote on you. If you say that you should eat boring food and take the nice things away from everyday life, it is repressive, it is negative, and you will not be elected. So I think it is that simple.
There's a question over there.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting. I have a question whether concerning another advice we repeatedly hear. We see it in the WHO report, we see it in the new Irish obesity plan, is that breastfeeding should prevent obesity in children. And as far as I know, there's no evidence whatsoever for that. And there's just been published a nice paper on that too, saying that breastfeeding is not the way. I think concerning physical activity and breastfeeding is that they are very good for other purposes. So if it could go into obesity too, it just seems so self-evident. But I think it'd be a good idea if you could comment also on the breastfeeding advice.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. There are lots of studies showing that breastfeeding is associated with a lower weight gain, but if you have nice controlled studies, you can't confirm it. And there are many studies showing that there is not a good preventive effect of breastfeeding. So you can't, again, cure obesity by breastfeeding your children. I think you're quite right. But still, we think that breastfeeding is positive, but honestly, the extreme good effect of breastfeeding are not there either if you look at big studies. I think it is better, and it's especially better for very young children, but I think it is militant group that really force people to breastfeed, and for people mothers who can't, I think this is a burden. So I do agree, we should reduce the pressure on breastfeeding in this area.
Other questions? Yes, microphone here.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's rather a short comment on this whole question, I think, which is coming back on how to bring the messages over. And I think there's a kind of an inconvenient truth that we should be maybe looking more deeply into, is that the democracies and the political system we live in is actually a pressure group system. And maybe we should become more we should politicize these messages, not only translating evidence towards policy making, but making it political also, and put more effort into understanding how to do it, how to bring it.
I think you're right, and I think we have to work on that.
Another question? Yeah, over there.
Thank you for your presentation, but I would like to return to this question of physical activity and seemingly no evidence of preventive effect of it. But we are not speaking just about this early childhood, but in long run about all life. If children will not get used to at least minimum amount of physical activity needed, which is not the case now in all of our countries. Most of children don't reach even this minimum amount, and if we are going to with such messages to politicians, our super sedentary lifestyle could become evidence-based, so I'm just afraid of it.
I agree. I mean, physical activity is very important for our health. It is important, it can reduce depression, it's good for later osteoporosis, it's good for many, many things. And it reduces diabetes, etc., etc. So we know that physical activity is important. But we should not promote physical activity based on the obesity preventive effect. Because I think that is the key. If we want to prevent obesity, we should not use physical activity for that.
If we have time, I think, for one more question. So if there's anyone who want to ask something, yes, over there. And while you get your microphone, I can say we were talking a lot about local government yesterday. And a tradition in Swedish preschools is that a child on his birthday brings ice cream for everybody. And knowing how many children are there, they eat a lot of ice cream. That local government could do something about that, I guess.
They could indeed do that. They could just say that we have a regulation, no sweets at all in nurseries, for example. They could easily do that.
Yeah, thank you. Mine is a comment. I want to give a comment on issue of breastfeeding. I think, to me, if I am talking of a child who is 0 to 6 months, I would say that breastfeeding will prevent obesity because the child would suck the milk according to the demand. But after 6 months, then if a parent is not careful, then will tend to overfeed the child, and the child might become obese. But for the age of 0 to 6 months, I would go for that can prevent obesity, because if you feed the child, before 6 months, you tend to overfeed the child. And another comment is on a physical activity. I think if somebody is already obese and want to reduce, I mean, diet alone, I think, will not be enough. I think we have to think of multiple action. If you want to burn the fat you already have, to me, I would still advocate physical activity. Thank you.
I think it's difficult. We know that breastfeeding is good, and we should promote breastfeeding, but we should do it based on the correct reasons. And obesity prevention is not one of them. It's exactly the same thing with physical activity. It's good for us, but it's not a good way to reduce obesity. So I think we have to see that there are two different things here. I don't say that physical activity and breastfeeding is bad. What I say is it's not a good way to prevent obesity. And I think we have to accept that, although we don't want to. And that is why this is on this evidence session, because we don't need that much more evidence. We need to accept the evidence we have. And that is maybe a tough one for all of us.
You know, I think you should write the boring cookbook. I think it could be a success, actually. Work together with the chef and you'll have it. Is there one last question for Claude? One, that's the last one. Microphone, please, just beside.
My issue is not so much whether there is no evidence that shows that either breastfeeding or physical activity has no effect on reducing obesity. But my interest is actually in the methodologies that we use to develop, whether it's to actually infer cause and effect. I think there's need for more research that actually could use different types of methodologies, modeling, as we saw yesterday, somebody talking about modeling. There's also a need for more creative ways in a way that we can, in the end, say, yes, there's no evidence where there's evidence. I cannot just dismiss it just like that because our methodologies are not able to tell us what's going on. Thank you.
Well, I can agree. When we don't see an effect, we should not repeat the same type of studies. We need to be creative and try to do something new. And then we can maybe change this pattern. Maybe we can show that in another way it is possible to educate parents with good effect, long-term effect on obesity. But with the present way, we have to accept it doesn't work.
Thank you, Claude Marcus.
Thank you.
And next speaker.